So I just want to acknowledge that I believe, are probably all coming from Treaty 7 land today. And if you are coming from outside of Treaty 7 territory, please feel free to let us know where you're joining from in the chat. For me, I have done a lot of reflecting on Nose Hill Park over the past month, especially as it's gotten really beautiful out. And of course, the medicine wheel is there. And I just am so appreciative that we've had this land and this space to use and to enjoy throughout this pandemic. So I encourage you to think about what land you have enjoyed as the weather has gotten nicer outside. And I will also say that, of course, next month is Aboriginal Awareness Month. I think Aboriginal Awareness Week, I want to say, is like June 21st. So I really encourage you to look at the Enough for All newsletter, to go to the Aboriginal Friendship Centre of Calgary, to find some of the events that are happening and to join those and to enhance your own learning. And, you know, an online powwow is actually pretty cool. I joined one last year, so try that out as well. Awesome. Okay. So we're glad that you are joining us again this month for our next conversation in the 369 series to hear more about the All Our Families study and what they learned about the critical role of language development. And so to that end, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Susan Graham from the Department of Psychology at the University of Calgary and Director of the Owerko Centre at UOC. So welcome. Susan, we'll hand it over to you.
So how many, like I've done so many Zoom things that I still can't manage to make this a seamless movement into my presentation. So sorry about that.
I haven't figured it out either, Susan, in case that's
not wanting to go for some reason. So my screen sharing is paused. That's very strange. So it worked. We did try that. Oh, there we go. We did try this and it worked beautifully. So, okay. So hopefully you can see my screen. Thanks everyone for joining today. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to be here. And I'm very glad that Dr. Suzanne Tuff is here as well, because as everyone likely knows, she is the PI of the All Our Families cohort. So any particular questions, she hopefully can chime in and answer at the end. So as was mentioned, I was hoping to talk to you a little bit about the learnings that we've gathered from the All Our Families cohort that have spoken to us about the factors that really potentiate language development before 5. But I wanted to begin by respectfully acknowledging that I live and work on the lands of Treaty 7, and that the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Region 3. So I wanted to, whoops, went too fast. I wanted to start just by maybe reminding us all, and maybe it's not necessary, but it's always fun for me to think about, that the years before 5 are a time of really remarkable change. And, you know, during this developmental period, children very rapidly acquire their language or languages, acquiring what we think is 5 to 6 new words a day between 18 months and 6 years of age. We estimate that by the time kids hit grade 1, they know about 10,000 words. At the same time that they're rapidly learning their language or languages, they're also undergoing very dramatic changes in their cognition during that time. They're gaining a much more sophisticated understanding of other people. They can begin to understand other people's intentions. They also begin to acquire a deeper understanding of the physical world and categorization of objects. Hopefully, as you can see illustrated in these pictures, and yes, they are my little girl who's now 15, that there's remarkable physical and brain development that happens during this time. So children go in a span of 5 years from really being barely able to hold up their heads at birth to being able to put on their own ski boots and ski down a hill by the time they're 5 years of age. So for many of us that are interested in child development, we readily embrace this notion that much of the foundation for health and well-being is laid down during these really early years. But of course, for many children in our communities and in our country, these development isn't proceeding as we would like to see it go. So what you see on the screen is a graphic from the Canadian Institute for Health Information. And this is results from the early development inventory. And so the early development inventory is filled out by kindergarten teachers. It's a large scale project I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But what you can see is from some data from about 4 years ago, I actually think this graphic is from, that 27% of Canadian children are vulnerable in one or more areas of development prior to entering grade 1. You can also see from the graphic that this percentage of children that are vulnerable to in areas of development varies by biological sex. So boys are much more likely to be vulnerable in development. And you can also see that it varies by neighborhoods. So children growing up in poorer neighborhoods, 36% of them are vulnerable versus 20% in richer neighborhoods. Well, if we look at some data from Alberta, and I apologize if many of you are exquisitely familiar with this, but this is the EDI, and what this table here outlines are the 5 different areas of development that teachers are asked to assess. So we have physical health and well-being, social competence, emotional maturity, and for the areas of my greatest interest, language and cognitive development, as well as communication skills and general knowledge. And whoops, it almost does this, right? So what you see here, though, is recent data from the city of Calgary. This was collected in 2016, as well as in the city of Alberta. And you see that the green indicates children that are rated as being on track. Yes, of course, you know, the dog's going to bark, the phone's going to ring, the kids are going to walk in. I'll just let you know that. It inevitably happens whenever I'm doing any kind of presentation. So what I'll say is that the green represents kids that are on track developmentally. The yellow represents kids that are at risk, and the red represents kids that are vulnerable. And what you see here is citywide Calgary. And if you're interested, you can go to this link and get data by neighborhood, as well as Alberta-wide data. And so what you see, and particularly in the areas that are most relevant for the presentation today, is that within Calgary and within Alberta, we have a significant proportion of kids that are falling behind in language and communication skills. So we see that in Calgary, 25% of our kids are deemed as vulnerable or having difficulty with language and cognitive development, and 34% are having struggles with communication and general knowledge. And when you look at the description of what's assessed on the EDI, this is, I think, particularly concerning, this 34%. So we have kids, we're asking whether or not kids have the skills to communicate their needs and wants in socially appropriate ways, whether they can use symbolic use of language, storytelling, and knowledge about life in the world. And I know you heard last month from my colleagues who emphasized the importance of storytelling as well. So a significant proportion of children in our communities and in Canada are already falling behind by the time they reach kindergarten. And so the challenge for us, of course, is, as you probably all well know, is that these early emerging developmental issues don't necessarily go away. Kids don't outgrow them. And critically, they can have cascading effects over development. So one of the challenges is to identify the factors that might put kids at risk for these developmental issues, as well as the factors that might help them and promote optimal development. So the All Our Families study has a wonderful role to play in helping us answer these questions. So I'll just talk a little bit first about the All Our Families study, and then tell you about some of the information or some of the learnings that we've gotten from studying the language development of the families in this cohort. So the All Our Families study is headed up by Suzanne Tuff, who is our fearless leader, and I'm glad she's here today. And so this is a large cohort study of over 3,000 families that were recruited during pregnancy. So mothers were recruited at 24 weeks of pregnancy and have been followed up until now, with our kids are 13 years of age. So what you see on the screen right here is the assessment points that we have fully completed to date. So there were 2 assessment points during pregnancy, And then again, when the children were 4 months, 12 months, 2, 3, 5, and 8. And of course, and I'm sure Suzanne would be happy to provide more information. There was recently 2 COVID surveys that have been completed. So we had the opportunity to ask families how they're doing at the beginning of the pandemic and now more recently. And we've also had the opportunity to ask the youth themselves how they are doing. And the youth are now around 12 to 13 years of age. So this is an ongoing study that really has a lot of rich data. I'm going to focus primarily on the data that we've collected up until the age of 5. Okay. So just so you know how representative this group is of both families in Calgary, Alberta, and in Canada. And it gives you a sense of how well the findings generalize. So this describes the characteristics of the families and the mothers in particular recruited into the study in comparison to Calgary. So that's these sort of pinky bars, Alberta, the green bars, and then Canada, which are the darker purple bars. And what you can see is in general, the sample is representative of the pregnant and parenting population in an urban center, with the one exception of income. So in general, the median income in the study at time of recruitment was around 100,000, which was consistent with the median income in Calgary, but higher than the income of other families in Canada. And so that probably had to do with the economic circumstances of Calgary at the time when the study began, but also probably also represents the groups that come into that are more likely to volunteer to participate in a research study. Okay. Whoops. So what you'll see is that the questions that were asked in the All Our Family studies are both specific to the kind of developmental period. So as you can see, obviously around this time, we would ask quite a bit about prenatal health, pregnancy history, etc. And now as the kids are getting older, we're asking about child development, behavior, temperament, screen time. But you'll also see that there are some questions that are consistent across the full assessment period, where we're asking about health services utilization, lifestyle, things like social support, emotional and physical health. What I think, and I can say this because I was not in at the beginning of the study, so it's not like I'm saying anything, I'm blowing my own horn, but what I'll say, what's really remarkable about the AOF team is how they have developed the questionnaires and engaged our community from the beginning in the kinds of questions that need to be asked. So what you see on this infographic here are the key steps that go into the process of developing each questionnaire. So at the beginning, there are the identification of important thematic areas and a search for standardized assessment tools. There's also community engagement, and I know Calgary Reads and the First 2000 Days Network have played a key role in helping to shape the questionnaires. And this just sort of goes further in describing how detailed the assessment tools are. Of course, one of the key issues is participant burden. So making sure that we are not overwhelming our participants. And Suzanne is very skillful at not letting researchers like myself in particular want to make all the questionnaire all about language development, but getting just enough so we know what's going on. And I can't see your face, Suzanne, so I don't know if you laughed about that or not. So the All Our Families study really takes this life course approach with the idea that understanding population health and well-being needs a perspective that views health as a product of risk behaviors, protective factors, environmental agents that we encounter throughout our life, and that really have these very cumulative and additive and even sort of interactive multiplicative effects on development. And so the idea behind the All Our Families study was that a healthy start to life is critical, as well as providing support for children and families throughout critical periods in their life. The goal, I think, ultimately is to gather evidence that will help policymakers promote timely investments with a high rate of return. So So let me walk you through an example that the team has developed to help, I think, the audience really understand why the study was started in the first place and how a life course approach can help us understand child development. Okay. So if you take an approach of two young boys, both of these young boys live in families that are lower income and both get ear infections. Now we know that those two factors can really put children at risk for developmental issues. Well, what if we also look at their mother's characteristics and her experiences? So we have one mother who has a history of abuse, postpartum depression, and sort of relatively poor mental health during pregnancy, versus a mother who doesn't have these same kind of issues. So we know from the data gathered that that child of the mother who has faced abuse or who has had poor mental health has a 53% greater risk of developing for developmental problems. Whoops. In contrast, the mother who herself has not had these same kind of challenges has a much lower risk, 19%. So of course, this tells us how factors like maternal well-being, intrauterine environments, and early childhood experience really influence the child's health and wellness. Well, what if both of these children live in families with high income? And again, our data allows us to look at this. And so again, the child of the mother who has faced abuse or poor mental health has a 38% chance now of a developmental problem, and 11% for the mother who hasn't had that. So a few things to take away from this slide is that income is only somewhat protective, of course. It's not fully protective. And the second is that the highest risk for poorer child developmental outcomes is seen when we have this confluence of risk factors, a lower income family, ear infections, a maternal history of poor mental health, which really suggests this cumulative effect. And it really highlights the complexity of understanding how we can promote child development. So let me turn now to a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and I think many people here too, is language development. And I probably don't need to convince you of the importance of language development in all aspects of children's lives, but I'll spend a few minutes thinking about it. So as I mentioned before, of course, language development is a very early emerging sort of developmental hallmark. You know, we see the roots of language development laid down really actually from in the uterine environment, but then really certainly from moments after birth. So well before children are actually producing their first words, a lot of language development has already happened. And we also know that language development and children's level of language development has key implications for many aspects of their development. So if you think about things like mathematics and literacy, children who have poorer language development can struggle more in these areas. Language plays a key role in self-regulation. Those toddlers that have better language skills often have better self-regulation skills. Language plays a key role in peer relations. Those children that are better able to respond appropriately in social situations, or who can pick up on those more subtle cues, have better peer relations. We know that children with language problems are more likely to be bullied as well. Language development has a long reach into occupational and academic achievement. So people with language issues can have much more limited occupational outcomes. And critically, language is intricately linked to mental health. So a recent study, a big meta-analysis that we did along with Rochelle Henges and Sherry Madigan, showed that children who have language concerns are at greater risk for both internalizing mental health issues, so things like depression and anxiety, as well as externalizing mental health concerns, so more the acting out kinds of behaviors. So of course, fostering optimal language development can help children in these other domains. So within all our families, we've had the opportunity to measure aspects of language development at various points along the lifespan of the cohort. So we've assessed language development at 12 months, at 2 years, at 36 months, and then more in depth at 5. We're continuing to ask more broadly about language skills at the 8 and now the later language things. But of course, we focused our most intensive examination of language development really happened in those first 5 years. So I just want to tell you about a couple of key studies that we've done looking at factors that predict language outcomes in children in our sample. So one study really looked at risk and protective factors for late talkers, and the other looked at language development trajectories between 12 and 36 months of age. So let me start first with this examination of late talkers. And this is really a project that has been led by Dr. Beverly Collison. And so many of you may be familiar with this idea of late talkers. Late talkers are children that it's not a clinical or a diagnostic term. These are children that are generally between about 18 months and maybe 30 months of age, and they seem to fall at the lower end of the language continuum. So typically we define them as kids that are producing or falling within the bottom 10th percentile. And one of the reasons why these kids have received so much interest is that there's been a lot of mixed findings about their longer term outcomes. So for some studies have found that these kids that are late talkers at around 2 really do fine. They go on to achieve sort of more typical language development. Other studies have found that these are kids that go on to have sort of specific language impairment or developmental language disorder. Other studies have found that they tend to be sort of those lower average kids. So they're just falling below their peers in their language development. And one of the challenges then with this kind of sort of heterogeneity in outcomes is knowing who should we intervene on and how should we intervene. So if at 2 you encounter a child who's falling below this 10th percentile, should they be a candidate for treatment? In this kind of context, one of the questions that we were really interested in within our sample is, well, if we look at kids that are late talkers at the time at around 23 to at 2 to 2.5, what factors can we see beforehand from the sort of either prenatal period or the birth to 24 months? What factors may have led them to be more at risk to be a late talker or more protective? So let me tell you a little bit about that. So within our sample, we identified children as late talkers if they fell below the 10th percentile on a vocabulary checklist. So this is the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory. It's filled out by parents, and parents are simply asked to check off the words that their child is producing. And this is really given usually between around 24 months. And so within our sample, the children range from about 23 to 30 months of age. Okay. And so when we looked at a sample of children that fit this within the All Our Families cohort, we found that we had around 13% of our children met that criteria of being considered a late talker. And the rest, of course, would fit within what we would describe as typical talkers. And what you see up here is just their median vocabulary of children who fell within this. So you can see the variability within their words produced. But what we were more interested in is what factors may have put them at risk or at more protective factors. So what we did is we identified, based on the literature, a large number of candidate factors that we also had assessed within the All Our Families cohort study. So we classified them as non-modifiable factors. So what we mean are factors that really would be very difficult at the point in the child's life to intervene. And they included things like child biological sex, whether or not they had a positive family history for speech and language issues, whether they were preterm status, as well as factors of how many children in the family, children under 5, adults in the home, time in Canada, other languages spoken, maternal age, and maternal education. And what you see is the ones that were bolded were the ones that actually sort of met criteria to be included in our model based on preliminary evidence. But I show you this to let you know that we did assess a wide number of factors. We also looked at things that we would perceive to be more modifiable factors. So these are things that actually could be targets for intervention. And they included whether or not children attended childcare, whether or not families read and shared books together, whether they engaged in formal community resources or informal play groups, whether they watched television, whether or not how the mother's physical health was, whether they had ear infections. We also initially investigated things like income and paid employment, as well as computer habits. So I think there's a few more, sorry, smoking, alcohol use, drug use, mother's mental health, emotional health, and their perspectives on parenting. So these were all pieces of information that we had. But again, the bolded ones are the ones that sort of in our analyses were candidates to be included in our models. So let me show you some of the results. And so these are odds ratios. And so basically what you see is around 1 is what we set as the comparison factor. So this is being male. If they fall below the line, this means it's sort of acting as kind of a protective factor. This is really loose, but if they fall above the line, they're acting more as a risk factor. So you can see within those non-modifiable factors, the 2 that came out were gender, or biological sex, I guess would be more accurately described. So if children were female, they were at less risk for being a late talker. Okay. You can also see that within this family history of a language delay, that the more family members, so whether 2 or more, the more family members that had a history of a language problem, the more the child themselves was at risk for being a late talker. So for those other modifiable factors, we found some very interesting data as well. And so the first factor that we looked at really closely was whether or not families shared books, and when they first introduced that into their family life. And what we found again was that if families read and shared books daily, that acted as a protective factor. So those children were less likely to meet status for being a late talker at 2. Those families that participated in informal play groups it also conferred some protective status for those kids. They were less likely to be late talkers. And then we also looked at care type. And again, we set mother care as the criterion. And what we saw in particular, the one to focus on is here in particular, that those children who were primarily cared for in childcare centers were less likely to be late talkers compared to children in all other forms of care. And I know that looks a bit sort of variable here, but really the only finding is being cared for in the only significant finding is being cared for in childcare versus the other types of care. So if we take this all together, I think the way that we sort of bring this together is that the key protective factors are language-based social interaction with a variety of communication partners. So of course, book reading is a language-based social interaction. Play opportunities confer that same advantage, and childcare as well. And the childcare one is particularly interesting, and I think it really is very consistent with a lot of research showing that infants, remember these are kids that are 2 and under, are highly sensitive to variability in the speech input, and having more variability really plays a critical role in supporting language learning. So when you have to hear a variety of different speakers or talkers, for example, who have different dialects or different accents, or even who produce words slightly differently, it offers the child the opportunity to have to abstract beyond that variability that's not meaningful and hone in on variability that is meaningful. I can Stacy, did you want me to pause here and ask if people have questions now before, or save it all for the end?
I think it's up to you, Susan, what you would like to do. I'm kind of, if anyone does have questions, you can put them into the chat while we're going along. And Susan, we can let you know if
Sure.
there's anything there.
Sure. Okay, I'm happy to. Whoops.
You know, if it was up to me, I'd be doing a little commercial right now about how important it is to do daily reading.
Well, I think for us, that was just, I mean, obviously we were very, very excited by that, that finding. So of course, you know, as I mentioned, one of the challenges is with these late talkers is that it's hard to sort of have a clear picture of later outcomes. And we've seen again in the literature that some children who are late talkers at 2 are what we consider to be these late bloomers, where they overcome their slow start. Some kids seem to fall within this persistent low average range. And some kids actually have a diagnosis of, or end up with a diagnosis of developmental language disorder. So this, of course, looking at that literature, and again, thinking about the rich data that we've had available to us within all our families, led us to try to take a different approach to these trajectories. So this next set of data that I'll show you, and I promise you I'm only going to show you 2 sets of data today, really focused on trajectories of language development. And this was led by Rochelle Henges in conjunction with Suzanne, Bev Collison, and Sherry Madigan. And here, what we did was try to identify trajectories between 12 and 36 months of age of language development. And to do so, what we did was we drew on the Ages and Stages questionnaire. And so the reason for that is because in order to do these kinds of trajectory analyses, you need to have the same measure at each point. So we were fortunate that in all our families, we had collected the ASQ at 12 months, 24, and 36 months of age. And through very sophisticated analyses that Rochelle did, we identified in our group of children 4 trajectories of language development within. So 4 different pathways, shall we say, between 12 and 36 months of age. So what you see on this graph here, first of all, I'll say is that this sort of shaded area here, according to the ASQ, are kids that would fall in the sort of monitor stage. So for those of you who know, don't know, the Ages and Stages questionnaire is a screening tool. And so kids who would fall here would signal to clinicians that we should be monitoring them. These children who fall in this sort of spotted area down here are kids who would fall into the referral. So they should be sent for more clinical evaluation. Okay. So within our classes, so within all our families cohort, we have 80% of our kids fall in what we would consider to be the high stable range. So these are kids that have high scores at 12 months that stay stable over time. Okay. And then we had around 5% of kids, that's the red line here, who fall within to what we would call kind of the moderate stable range. So these are children that are sort of at this kind of moderate level of language and communications, and that stays consistent across the time. The third are these very interesting, what we would consider to be maybe late bloomers. So these are kids, and this was about 13% of our sample. So these are children that started out with relatively low, lost my cursor, relatively low scores on the communication subscale at 12 months, but they show rapid increases at both 24 and 36 months of age. Okay, and then finally, we have this really, really small class within our sample, and these are children that we could describe as low decreasing, and this is only about 1.5% of the sample. And these are kids who started out sort of already with some relatively low scores, but by the time they're 3, their scores are decreasing over time, and they're by the time they're 2, actually, they're into the referral stage. Okay. So that's very descriptive, and it sort of shows sort of where kids are following. But what we were really interested is looking at what predicts kids' membership in these trajectory classes. So one of the factors we looked at, based on, of course, some of our previous research in the literature, would be gender. I realize I should actually be calling that biological or sex, actually, because it's really the parents' identification of their child's sex. And what we see is that in all three of the classes, both the increasing, the low, the moderate stable, and the decreasing, they're much more likely to be boys. And this, of course, is consistent with sort of a broad literature on developmental issues, that boys are much more likely to have developmental issues than girls. We also looked at how family history of language talking, or sorry, of language delay or late talking factored into this. And again, we see that, so the children in the high stable class, they did have some family members, but only about 16.5% had family members with a language issue. The kids that were these late bloomers, shall we say, about a quarter of them had that. But significantly, those children who fall into this moderate stable, almost a third of them had at least one parent or grandparent or sibling who was a late talker or who had a language delay. Okay, we also looked at income. And the only difference that emerged here was that those children in the moderate stable range, again, about 31.5% of them had an income that fell below, had a family income that fell below $60,000 in the sample. And recall that in this sample, the median income was over 100,000 in this sample. Okay. We also looked at developmental issues, and in particular focus on the APGAR scores. So these are the scores that are given at birth that sort of indicate well-being at birth. And we see that those kids that are falling, that are in the low decreasing class, that a significant number of them, almost 27%, had lower APGAR scores. Okay. So we not only did we look at the predictors, we also looked at the outcomes at 36 months. So we wanted to see whether or not these trajectories were associated with different child outcomes. And when in doing these, we controlled for sort of the effects of different predictors on these outcome analyses. So one of the things we looked at was a measure of language development that was separate from the ages and stages communication scale. And this is, again, the MacArthur CDI-3, and it's a 100-word checklist. And what you see is that, of course, the kids in the high stable group have strong vocabulary at 36 months of age. In contrast, those kids in the moderate, and so they're producing, around 75 words. Those kids in the moderate stable are actually producing around in the upper 20s out of 100 words. Those kids in the low increasing, if you remember from the trajectory, they looked like they had almost caught up to the high stable on the ages and stages questionnaire. And they have on that questionnaire, but here we see that their vocabulary is still significantly lower than those high stables. So if they're late bloomers, they are catching up on a screening measure, but not fully catching up on a vocabulary measure. And here, I'm sure you can barely see this, but of course, those kids in the low decreasing group are barely producing any words at all. Okay. We also looked at whether or not there were differences between the classes in terms of receiving a developmental delay diagnosis by age 3. So only about 1%, you can't even sort of see them here, only about 1% of the kids in the high stable class had received a developmental delay diagnosis, which is significantly lower than any of these 3 classes. What you see here is that about 50%, over 50% actually, of the kids in the low decreasing have been identified as having some kind of potential developmental issue, and as well have been referred to see a speech language pathologist. Okay. And then finally, we looked at a variety of different measures and outcomes. And one of the things that we did have was a measure of various kinds of sort of behavior issues for children at 36 months. And the only factor that came out were ADHD symptoms, where you see that the kids in the low increasing class and the low decreasing class had higher ratings on inattention and hyperactivity than the kids in the other two classes. So what does this mean? So I think there's sort of, from my perspective, a number of key kind of implications from this study. One is the question of whether or not children fall as late talkers versus late bloomers. And as I mentioned, one of the things that's interesting to distinguish is between these two classes right here. It's possible that if you were to look at these kids at 24 months, which is when we typically identify kids as late talkers, that they would look the same. But as you can see, they follow a very different developmental trajectory. So those kids that are the sort of late bloomers do sort of catch up in their language development. Maybe not fully to the kids, as I mentioned, who are at a higher level, but certainly are doing better than these kids. These children who are in the moderate stable class are the kids I think that are of sort of the biggest concern for us. So they're most likely to fall under the radar because they're not as sort of severe at the start at 12 months as these kids. So they're not likely to be identified. But they're not really improving, and they're showing deficits in vocabulary at age 3, and they're greater risk for these developmental delays and continued language problems. They also were the class where children had relatively lower family incomes, which may make it harder for them to get adequate support. And of course, only about a third of these kids had received in our sample had received any referral by age 3. Despite the fact that they were starting to fall within this referral class. Okay. These kids were wanting to look a little bit more at, they didn't necessarily have a lot of diagnostic information on them at age 3, but we're going to sort of continue to look at them using the sort of later data points. Oops, is that going to come out weird? So I just wanted to end with just a couple of sort of take homes. And one is just emphasizing again the cascading effects of language issues across development, that if we don't identify kids early on, they are at greater risk for problems that multiply moving into other areas of development. And then I also just wanted to highlight, because we did not address this in the data that I showed you so far, is really that language development, we identified those risk and those protective factors, but I also wanted to highlight that there's this sort of complex interaction of factors and this idea of sort of a goodness of fit. And this is just a graph from a recent study from our All Our Families data, led by Rochelle Henges, where we looked at the interaction between the child's characteristics, their temperament in particular, and maternal mental health on language skills. And these are results from about 250 kids that we actually brought in to the Owerko Centre at age 5 and did a full speech and language pathology assessment on them. And what I just want you to take home from this graph here is this interaction between the environment, if you will, in terms of the mother's depression level, and the child's own level of effortful control. So effortful control is a temperament measure, those kids that are able to better self-regulate. And what you see is that those kids who are higher in effortful control are relatively uninfluenced by experience with maternal depression in terms of their language skills per se. Those kids, though, who are lower in effort for control, as their mother reports more and more symptoms of depression, they score lower on language skills. So I think I present this just to sort of highlight that it's really this very complex interaction of factors that shapes these developmental outcomes. And that is it. And I just wanted to say thank you for having me here today. as well as to thank our amazing All Our Families research team and our incredible funders who've made this all possible. So thank you very much. And I can stop sharing my screen now, and then I can see everybody, and then we can chat.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. There are some great questions that are in the chat right now. So I thought I'd just jump right in. So there's a bit of a discussion around the Lena findings and just the differences with adult talk and turns in the home versus the childcare setting. So we're wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. And of course, once again, it highlights how findings differ across studies. So our measure was, were they in childcare versus not in childcare? And this again was between sort of 12 and 24 months of age as well. I am familiar with the Lena study showing that the number of turns and the actual and input matters. So I would hazard that I think it's probably a balancing between the type of childcare setting as well as the research setting. So I think the Lena data is from the US. Am I right? So
that's right, Susan.
Yeah. So childcare quality in the US is, because of accreditation standards and licensing standards, are quite variable. And so what we would consider in Alberta to be our fundamental ratios that are, your basic level in a childcare center are representative of high quality in studies in the US. So I think it's hard to export those findings across the border. I know that people are starting to do more work here in Canada on Lena. I know Melanie Soderstrom's been doing some stuff in Winnipeg, looking at whether or not there's actually intelligibility issues, right? So how, is there so much background noise that in childcare centers that kids aren't hearing language? So I think it just illustrates the complexity of it. Ours was a fairly blunt measure, right? And again, remember, we have a pretty high income sample in an urban center, and I think Alberta has a good childcare standards. So yeah, that's a great question though.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Lena's going to help us know more about that too.
Yeah. And Lorraine, that was part of your discussion. Did you want to bring anything else? Is there anything that we missed maybe that you wanted to mention?
No, that's what I was. Sorry, Susan, I don't have my computer, so I'm on my phone. So
okay.
I'm not sharing my, computer issues. I think you're exactly right that it's the difference in settings, and also the fact that the children in childcare settings in the US are under 1 as well.
Yeah.
That was some of the data that we saw of that. And of course, we're looking forward to doing more on that project as well, as you know. So
yes. Yeah, exactly.
Great. Yeah. And then Megan, I'm just going to read her comment here, or into the question, that it says, I believe children who hear more than one language at home was presented in the non-modifiable factor slide. Given that 1 in 5 Calgarians speak a language other than English at home, I'm wondering if you can speak more about this factor as it relates to the outcome.
So there's been some evidence or some questioning in the late talking literature as to whether or not hearing more than one language is, I'm not going to call it a risk factor because it's not, it doesn't come out, and I don't think it ever is. But I think it's been kind of used as a proxy and has been, in the literature, has been confounded, particularly in studies from the US, with a lower income. Because in the US, where a lot of the studies are done with Latinx populations, there's a confound with lower income. So as a risk factor, it's been very difficult to separate those things out. I'll say that there isn't a lot of evidence that children who are growing up in either simultaneous bilingual homes or non-English as a first language, are at any greater risk than kids who are growing up in one language homes, right? And in fact, if you look around, like I always find it very interesting, because if you look around the world, and just as you mentioned, with 1 in 5 kids in Calgary growing up, this idea of a monolingual home is much more of a rarity than a multilingual home. But it's kind of the lens that often we in North America put on it. And again, I'm just talking. I'm on my soapbox again, right up on my soapbox. But it's really interesting when you look at bilingualism research differences, and we have some amazing researchers here in Canada who study bilingualism, often French English bilingualism, just for historical reasons. But the data that we see here in Canada is quite different from the data in the US. And again, I think it has to do with sort of also a cultural ethos around multilingualism, where, you know, we have French immersion programs and many other immersion programs because many parents in our society value multilingualism, and that historically hasn't necessarily been the case from our neighbors to the south. So
And
that was
Susan,
a
I'll
really
just
long-winded answer.
there's some framing on why I asked that. I think that's really interesting. And I love the point that you said, like, it's just such an increasingly part of our world. My nephew, who's now 6, he grew up in a Spanish English household in the US, fairly affluent. Both of his parents are doctors, but he was a late talker. They were very concerned. And when they started bringing him to specialists, they said very common in bilingual households. And it's like one day he just woke up and just didn't stop talking fluently in both languages. It was really, there's high concern, and then it almost rectified itself. It felt like overnight. So I was wondering if you were seeing that too.
Yeah, I mean, that's often been said, that that kids that are growing up in simultaneously bilingual or multilingual have fewer words, but it's actually not usually the case when you count the words in all of the languages. So what you'll see maybe is they might have dog in English and not in Spanish, but then they might have a word in Spanish that they don't have in English. But it sounds to me like that your nephew is really a late bloomer, right? Those kids that you're like, oh, at 2, don't know, but then look really good. And we just don't know enough about who those kids are versus, you know, who those kids that kind of fall in that moderate stable sort of range. So yeah.
And I wouldn't want to wait and see.
No.
Because early intervention matters. And as a speech pathologist, we, advocated for that for years, that you don't know which ones are the late talkers and which ones are the late bloomers. And so we treat them all. So yeah. I would hate it if people said, wait and see, because they could just grow out of it. Sorry.
No, I totally agree with you, Lorraine. Or if people said, oh, well, it's because they're learning 2 languages. I would still encourage parents to not wait based on that either. The schools have I think, concern of kids who come from sort of non-English backgrounds here in Calgary, and who then at 5 are heading to kindergarten in English. They are, I never remember the term English late learners. Anne McCo, maybe you remember. And so I think that is one, that's an academic issue that you're suddenly taking. This would be like if you took me and put me, in Sweden or in Hong Kong or something, right? You're just suddenly immersed in a whole new thing. That input and that language system they have eventually will help them learning that other language. So. But I mean, I think for parents, it is good if you're planning to send your kids to school in English and not in an immersion program, it is helpful to at least give them English exposure before they hit school. So, yeah, that wasn't really like groundbreaking revelation, was it? As I heard myself saying them.
Language exposure in English, but important that they get the best home language they can.
Yes.
So their English language exposure may be from play groups or childcare providers or daycare, but their home language should always be what the parent is most proficient in.
Yeah.
Because what we were finding is some kids were coming to school without a first language because their parents were trying to speak to them in English because people have told them to speak in English, but they don't speak English very well.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And that's where I think some people have had concerns about childcare settings in terms of if the childcare workers are speaking in English and aren't highly proficient English speakers, that maybe there's not as rich of input as you would like to see it. I think the good thing is kids get input in a lot of different places, you know. So I can try to scroll down and see.
Did anyone else have any other questions? There doesn't look like there's anything else in the chat. There's.
Hmm.
Can I ask one more question? Sorry, I found your presentation really amazing. It's probably not cool for one of the co-hosts to be asking all the questions out of personal curiosity, but here you go. You mentioned like different interventions and there's speech language pathologists and others. I wonder, just out of curiosity, anchoring it to poverty, are there barriers that are unique to people who live in poverty to accessing some of those resources that would be really helpful? And what does that look like?
I think other people on the call can probably chime in around this. I guess for me, and again, I'm back up on a soapbox here, but I always worry that that sometimes we equate poverty with poor parenting. And I think you framed it just beautifully. It's not poor parenting, it's opportunity and accessibility, in the same way that we're seeing people not accessing vaccines, you know. Maybe maybe not everybody could get on last Monday at 7 a.m. like I did and got my teenagers done the very next day because I, have flexible work, etc. So I think hopefully providing more services where people are. So if childcare centers, if parents are using childcare centers, if we can have people and childcare workers maybe more attuned to potential language issues, and not just saying to the parent, oh, I'm worried about your kid, but I'm worried about your kid and here are some things you can try. And I think Lorraine, I apologize if there's other SLPs on the call, but Lorraine can probably speak to how some of this sort of interventions are relatively sort of straightforward. Input, monitoring, understanding, sensitive input as well. Not so simply talking, but trying to draw out questions, trying to provide opportunities. There was a really interesting study that was done in the US, and I can't remember where they went around in a supermarket and they put signs up that said, ask your child where milk comes from. And so they had sort of put these really interesting signs at different places. And so instead of saying, talk to your kid, it was like, it gave parents right in the moment an idea of what they could do or what they could say. And so maybe providing those really sort of handy tips, maybe also saying to parents, if they are coming from a non-English background, I'm speaking from a sort of, our English school language system, is give them permission to say, please speak to your child in your first language, so that, it's input. It doesn't matter whether it's English or non-English. It's all about having a rich language input. So.
Absolutely. Meet them at their level, words and turns. Yeah, easy.
I have a question that I'm interested in people's perspectives on. I mean, I think, and Suzanne asks this question way better than I ever do, but we have a fairly rich data set. Are there questions that this group would want to see if we could answer with some of our data? And
well, I'll start off, Susan. I'll start off to give people an idea. So an example of what we would love some feedback on. So Susan's presented some amazing data about the link between temperament and outcomes within a certain context. And I find myself wondering about, do we need to know more about the relationship between a child's temperament and the best way to express themselves, language being, I mean, of pinnacle importance, and then what else? And would that be helpful in terms of providing vehicles for families to improve language, but not necessarily do it through a language focused approach? So like I think it's just so clear across the body of literature how important language is for lifelong success. So we got to get that, but do we need to think of more innovative ways to have that as the outcome? Would be one. Would that answering that be helpful? Or do you need to know how these kids are doing now that they're age 8? What's happened to those moderate, stable kids? Are they the ones that end up needing more services through Calgary Reads or elementary school systems? So that's what Susan's kind of seeking, and we're curious about your feedback.
I think it should be like a prize that people get to ask their questions in your survey, and they're getting first dibs because they were on the session today. It's like gold to be able to have a question embedded into scientific research. So if I would be thinking really hard about what those questions might be, and feel free to email them to us after the session, because it really is an important opportunity to have Susan and Suzanne's generous offer of what are you curious about pertaining to this information that you learned today. And that doesn't happen every day that you get this opportunity. It has certainly been helpful to Calgary Reads for us to be able to ask questions of all our family study, and then years later to be able to still go back and say, okay, we didn't have resources to do much about that finding now, but maybe we could do this in a different way. So I do think it's a very generous offer that you have put out there for people to submit their questions. So thank you both very much for that opportunity.
One of the things that occurs to me, is that we haven't looked at the, those early language. One of the things that I've been wanting to look at, and maybe this is more impetus to do it, is look at these sort of language rich learning opportunities in the first 2 years, and how long is their reach, and to 5 and to 8, because that, again, hopefully would provide some evidence for investments, how those investments can pay off. So, yeah.
I think it would be fascinating too to understand if you help facilitate children's ability to access language by giving them some of this mental health vocabulary that's really important, in particular around emotional literacy and the ability to name how you're feeling. The child who isn't able to have that vocabulary to explain their feelings acts it out sometimes in the ways that we see show up in self-regulation or all kinds of things. And with such an emphasis in our community, and as we think about post-pandemic, recognizing, the rise of mental health within our community, what could a world be like where 2-year-olds can discern between mad and sad and disappointed and scared, and sometimes just the lack of the vocabulary is preventing things. I'd love to know more about, how could we intervene really early and help save some of the later consequences for children who still aren't able to name their feelings in a way that's helpful to processing them. So we're in the final minute because it's only 69 minutes, right, that we get to have. So I'm going to thank Susan again so much for the
Well,
information
thank you.
that we learned from you today. I just still wrote notes and I've heard it before and I can't hear it enough because it just reiterates the important work that we are all trying to undertake to improve the well-being of our children. Next month, I hope you will join us because we're going to continue on in this vein around language with Lena, which you heard a few of the questions sort of connect to in the chat. And we have the one of the facilitators from Denver coming to do the Lena presentation to speak about their early words, early talk presentation. And Janelle, who leads our Calgary Reads Lena work, will also be talking about the ways in which we are scaling this impressive program across our city. So I hope that all of you that were here today can join us next month. And I saw that Paxton put the link into the chat so you could register right away. And please feel free to pass the 369 series along to everyone in your network. And we look forward to seeing everyone in June.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining.